What if I told you one of today's most feared nations was actually handpicked by God long before it was ever feared? Not just mentioned in the Bible, but written into its very DNA, from the opening pages of Genesis to the apocalyptic warnings of Revelation. That nation is Iran. But the Bible calls it something different: Persia. While headlines scream of nuclear threats, covert alliances, and looming wars in the Middle East, few realize this moment has been thousands of years in the making. Persia wasn't just a nation. It was a divine instrument, at times used for destruction, at other times for salvation. And it all begins where the world was reborn, after the flood. After the waters receded and the ark found its rest on the mountains of Ararat, humanity faced a fresh beginning. Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were the roots from which all civilizations would grow. Genesis 10 lays out their descendants in what scholars call the Table of Nations, a genealogy that doubles as a map of the ancient world. Hidden within that list are 2 names many skip over, but they would go on to shape history: Madai and Elam. Madai, a son of Japheth, became the father of the Medes. They were fierce, mountain-dwelling warriors who settled in the northern highlands of what is now modern-day Iran. They were not builders of cities, but builders of tribes, rugged, independent, and unyielding. Elam, on the other hand, descended from Shem, the same line that would eventually bring forth Abraham. His people, the Elamites, lived in the lush, fertile plains of southwestern Iran near the Persian Gulf. Unlike the Medes, they built cities, formed alliances, and created armies that left a lasting mark on ancient history. And then came the first international war in the Bible. Genesis 14 paints the picture. 4 eastern kings, including Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, joined forces to invade the Jordan Valley. They overran cities, enslaved peoples, and took Lot, the nephew of Abraham, as a prisoner. This wasn't a minor skirmish. Elam had become a dominant military force, so much so that it dared to strike at the very people of faith. But Abraham wouldn't let it stand. With just 318 trained servants, Abraham launched a daring nighttime attack, defeated the coalition, and rescued Lot. It was an impossible victory, but one that sent a thunderous message echoing through time. No Eastern empire, no matter how powerful, can triumph against a man chosen by God. Elam was humiliated, but not destroyed. Over the centuries, the descendants of Elam and Madai continued to grow, dwell, and spread. Their lands overlapped, their cultures mingled, and eventually their destinies merged. What began as scattered tribes would become a mighty empire, Persia, when pagan nations served divine purpose. It might seem unthinkable that God would use pagan nations for his own purposes. And yet, through the voices of prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, God revealed exactly that. The first prophecy was judgment. Babylon, the empire that had crushed Jerusalem and burned the temple, would itself fall. And who would deliver that judgment? The united peoples of Elam and Media. But the second prophecy was even more shocking. God declared that a king, an unborn Persian ruler named Cyrus, would not only rise to power but become his instrument of mercy. This pagan king would free the Jews from exile, rebuild the temple, and fulfill prophecies spoken over a century earlier. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus. Isaiah 45 verse 1. God called him his anointed, not a prophet, not a priest, a Persian king, named by God 150 years before he took his first breath. And history records that Cyrus did exactly what Isaiah foretold. In the 8th century BC, a Median king named Deioces united the tribes of Elam and Madai, establishing Ecbatana, the first capital of a rising empire on Iranian soil. His grandson, Cyaxares, took the reins next. A military genius, he restructured the Median army into a formidable force that laid siege to, and ultimately destroyed, Nineveh, the capital of the brutal Assyrian Empire. The pieces were falling into place. Persia was rising, not by accident, not by coincidence, but by divine design. God was shaping history with a precision that would baffle historians for centuries. While empires rose and fell, and armies clashed over territory and pride, there was an invisible hand moving it all toward prophecy. A captive sees the future. And that's when the dreams began. Far away in Babylon, a young Jewish exile named Daniel was living in the court of the very empire that had destroyed his homeland. Torn from Jerusalem as a teenager, he now stood in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, serving his captors. Yet Daniel was no ordinary prisoner. God had given him a rare gift, the ability to interpret dreams, and even see visions of the future. When King Nebuchadnezzar had a terrifying dream of a colossal statue, no one in Babylon could interpret it. Worse yet, the king demanded someone tell him what the dream was before explaining what it meant. Every wise man in Babylon failed, except Daniel. He described the vision in detail, a towering statue made of different metals: gold, silver, bronze, iron, clay. "You, O king, are the head of gold," Daniel said, "but after you, another kingdom shall arise, the chest and arms of silver." That silver figure, it symbolized the Medo-Persian Empire, the very same empire that was already forming in the mountains and plains of ancient Iran. Daniel didn't just interpret a dream. He saw the future of world empires, and Persia was at the heart of it. The very nation that once enslaved God's people would one day set them free. The Elamites and Medes, the forefathers of Persia, who once marched to war against Abraham's family, would one day bow to God's plan, not in defeat, but in obedience. Persia would become the vessel through which God would conquer Babylon, fulfill Isaiah's and Jeremiah's prophecies, and allow the Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple. It is one of the most astonishing reversals in biblical history. A pagan empire becomes the liberator of God's people. But Persia's story doesn't end there. In fact, the most terrifying part is still to come. What if the same empire that once freed God's people returns in the last days to fight against them? This is not fiction. It's prophecy. Long before Iran made headlines, before nuclear deals and secret war pacts, the Bible already recorded its final role. Persia, now modern-day Iran, will rise again in a terrifying alliance known as Gog and Magog, a war that Revelation says will shake the very foundations of the world. But how does a nation go from being chosen by God to becoming part of the final rebellion against Him? To answer that, we return once more to the prophet Daniel. Still living in Babylon, Daniel saw another vision, this time of two beasts. One was a ram with two horns, charging westward, northward, and southward. Nothing could stop it. Then suddenly, a goat with a single horn came from the west, crossed the whole earth without touching the ground, and shattered the ram in a furious strike. Confused, Daniel asked for understanding, and an angel of the Lord answered. The two-horned ram represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece. This wasn't just history foretold, it was spiritual warfare revealed. Persia would rise to dominate the known world. But it would not last forever. Another power, Alexander the Great of Greece, would crush it. And that's exactly what happened. The Persian Empire, under rulers like Cyrus and Darius, ruled a vast territory from India to Egypt. They rebuilt temples, issued decrees, and made kings tremble. But eventually, as Daniel saw, the silver gave way to bronze. Persia fell. Yet its spirit, its geopolitical identity, never vanished. The people, the land, the ideology remained, and prophecy says they would rise again. Fast forward to the modern age. Iran, once Persia, now stands again as a powerful, theocratic nation. But this time, it doesn't rule in favor of God's people. It opposes them. Iran today is a central figure in a complex network of alliances hostile to Israel, much like the coalition described in Ezekiel 38. The infamous Gog and Magog War. In Ezekiel's vision, the prophet sees a massive alliance of nations gathering to invade Israel in the latter days. Among the nations listed are Magog, interpreted by many as Russia or Central Asia, Gomer and Togarmah, Turkey and surrounding regions, Cush, Sudan, Ethiopia, Put, Libya, and crucially, Persia, the only one named directly by its ancient name. The Lord speaks to Gog, the leader of this coalition. Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, all with shields and helmets. Ezekiel 38, verse 5. These nations aren't just nearby neighbors. They form a prophetic axis of resistance against Israel. And Persia, ancient and once chosen, now finds itself on the wrong side of the battlefield. But why? When the chosen turn. Persia's decline from prophetic hero to apocalyptic threat is one of Scripture's most sobering lessons. It reminds us that no nation is permanently righteous, and no empire is guaranteed favor, unless it continues to align with God's will. After Cyrus and Darius, Persian kings like Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus in the Book of Esther, became symbols of pride and godlessness. It was under Xerxes that Haman tried to exterminate the Jews, a foreshadowing of Iran's modern threats. Persia's shift wasn't just political, it was spiritual. They went from building the temple of God to seeking the destruction of his people. And that trajectory has never fully reversed. Ezekiel says that in the last days, when Israel is living in peace and prosperity, this alliance led by Gog will decide to attack. I will bring you against my people Israel like a cloud covering the land. In days to come, I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me. Ezekiel 38, verse 16. But what they don't expect is that this war won't be won by Israel's army or any earthly force. God himself will fight. He will unleash a massive earthquake. Confusion will cause the armies to turn on one another. Torrential rain, hailstones, fire, and brimstone will fall. It will be a divine judgment witnessed by the whole world. And I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations. Ezekiel 38, verse 23. God's message will be clear. No matter how powerful a nation becomes, it cannot win against the will of the Almighty. Not even Persia. Let's look at the Ark. In Genesis, Persia is born through Madai and Elam. In Daniel, Persia rises to power as a chosen instrument of God. In Isaiah, Persia is named before its kings are born. In Ezra, it becomes the tool of restoration. In Esther, it turns against God's people. In Ezekiel, it joins the final enemy alliance. In Revelation, it falls with the nations in rebellion. A complete cycle, from God's servant to God's opponent. Yet, even in that, God's sovereignty remains. He wrote the beginning, controls the middle, and determines the end. What does this mean for us today? When you hear about Iran in the news, its nuclear ambitions, its secretive partnerships, its growing hatred for Israel, know this: you are watching prophecy unfold. The alliances being formed are not random. The enemies named are not guesses. And the final confrontation is not a matter of if, but when. But fear not. For every time Persia tried to crush God's people in the past, it failed. Because the same God who defended Abraham, raised up Daniel, and guided Cyrus, is still on the throne. A warning and a promise. Persia's story is both a warning and a promise. A warning that even the most noble nation can fall if it turns from God. A promise that even when enemies gather like a storm, God will protect his own. Iran's rise is not random. It's a final piece of a divine puzzle. A nation foretold. A prophecy unfolding. A reminder that the Word of God is alive, sharp, and playing out before our eyes. Watch. Pray. Prepare. Because Persia's final chapter is not just Iran's story. It's ours too. Make sure hit that subscribe button and share this video.